Welcome back to Knack Kitchen, where this week we are making lemon tart or tart au citron. And although I may not know my French, I do know that this tart is absolutely delicious. And without further ado, let's just see how we make it. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to beat some butter, and here I have a combination of salted and unsalted butter, but you can use either, whichever is available to you. And once your butter is light and fluffy, you can go ahead and add your sugar and beat that thoroughly as well. I'd also quickly mention that the butter that we are using here is supposed to be at room temperature. This pastry crust is more like a cookie dough as opposed to a short crust pastry which you might be used to. So once the butter and sugar has been creamed together, we can go ahead and add our egg. So if your mixture spreads too much, then use a spatula and scrape down your bowl so that when you're beating the mixture, it is done evenly. So now we're going to go ahead and add our orange zest. It is optional but highly recommended. Then we'll also add a dash of vanilla and beat that all together as well. So now we can go ahead and add the flour, and I generally add the flour in 2 batches, but you can add it all together as well. Make sure to first manually mix it into your butter, otherwise you'll be left with a cloud of flour all over the place. So now I'll go ahead and add the remaining flour, and the mixture will go from being creamy to being more like a cookie dough. And at that point, you can go ahead and ditch your mixer and use a spatula to bring the dough together. In all fairness, I'm just going to ditch the spatula as well and eventually just use my hand because it's easier that way and you get a feel for the dough as well. So now we're just going to move the dough around the bowl. You'll notice that the dough will start clearing the sides, and then you know that it's ready. Now please be aware that you're not supposed to over knead the dough, because the more you knead it, the more gluten you'll develop and the tougher your pastry will end up being. So now that our pastry dough is ready, it needs to go into the refrigerator to chill for about 30 to 40 minutes. For that, I like to transfer the dough onto a plastic wrap, and I also like to flatten it out as much as I possibly can, because that just makes it easier to roll the pastry once it's chilled. So once I've got the plastic wrap on, I like to use a rolling pin just to flatten the dough out even more before it goes into the refrigerator. So now our dough is ready to go into the refrigerator, and after about 35 to 40 minutes, I take it out on my pastry mat. Now if you don't happen to have a pastry mat, you don't need to worry. You can just use parchment paper or even a plastic wrap and roll your pastry out between 2 sheets of plastic wrap. So now we'll just check if we've rolled the pastry to the right size by using our tart pan as a guide. The easiest way to transfer this pastry onto the tart pan is to directly flip it onto it. After that, if there are any cracks, then you can just patch them in together. So now we're just going to go ahead and trim the excess pastry. However, we are going to keep about ½ an inch of excess overhanging. That is because the pastry is going to shrink as it bakes in the oven. So now we're just going to prick the base with a fork, which prevents the pastry from rising too much when it's blind baking. So now we're just going to add a layer of parchment paper or butter paper before we add our baking beans. So here for the baking beans, I'm using some chickpeas. If you do not have chickpeas, then you can use kidney beans, or you can even use rice. The baking beans help to keep the pastry in place during blind baking, so try not to skip this step. Now this goes into a preheated oven for about 10 minutes. After that, we are going to remove the baking beans. We are also going to trim off the excess on the edges because it's not going to shrink any further. And then we're just going to clean off our pan and then add this pastry back into the oven for about 5 to 7 minutes until it is cooked. So after about 5 to 7 minutes, our pastry is ready. We're going to set this aside while we move on to preparing our lemon filling. This particular lemon filling is very easy to make and only requires 4 ingredients. So we start by adding the eggs and sugar into a bowl, and then we're just going to beat this together until combined. So when the eggs and sugar are combined, we'll add the fresh cream and give that a mix as well. Now finally, we'll add the lemon juice and stir that in as well. I also like to add a little bit of food coloring, but that is optional. Now you'll notice that there is a bit of foam on the top of our filling, so we'll get rid of that by using a napkin. You do want to get rid of the foam because it gets very pale and unsightly if you do not get rid of it and you bake your tart just as is. So now we're ready to pour our filling into our prepared pastry crust, and then this goes into a preheated oven for about 35 minutes. So after about 35 to 40 minutes, the center of our tart should be set, and that's when you know that it's ready. So now we let the tart come down to room temperature, and then we are ready to dust it with some icing sugar. Now once your tart is cooled, you may notice a few cracks, and that is natural, so you do not need to worry. It is still gonna taste absolutely delicious. So here we have our final lemon tart, and you can make one large tart or individual sized portions as well. So now I'm just slicing into a tart to show you what it looks like on the inside, and you'll be able to see just how smooth and creamy the filling looks. So I'm gonna treat myself to a bite, and I hope that you try this recipe as well and that you love this tart just as much as I do. If you like this recipe, don't forget to give a thumbs up, and please do subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next week.